You're listening to Things You Should Know, and I'm your host, Andy Ngo. In this episode, I interview Brendan O'Neill, the editor-in-chief of Spiked Online. O'Neill was once a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, but now calls himself a Marxist libertarian. He's controversial for his die-hard support of Brexit and outspoken criticism of political correctness. I spoke with him from London. My first question was about his work with Spiked Online's predecessor, Living Marxism, which was a magazine of the Revolutionary Communist Party.
It was the first magazine I worked for. It was a really good magazine. I know people look at it and think, Marxism, what the hell? Or they say living Marxism is a contradiction in terms. I really hate it when people say that. But it was a really good magazine. It was a very principled magazine. It had lots of the same principles that Spiked currently has. It was very pro-freedom of speech. It was very pro-democracy. It was very pro-individual choice.
It was a communist.
It made all those arguments from a radical Marxist perspective. And when I say that to people, they think it's a contradiction to say that you can be a Marxist and to believe in individual freedom, but actually it isn't. And if you go back to the early Marx, the early Engels, that early writing, particularly in the 1800s, so much of it was devoted to the question of how to expand human choice and how to liberate humanity from need or oppression or anything else that was hindering the choices people could make in their lives. I'm the first to admit that Marxism and leftism went wrong very quickly, and certainly by 1900 it was just pointless and disastrous. But the early stuff, unlike people with rock bands when they say I prefer the early stuff, with Marxism I prefer the early stuff. I think the left had a lot going for it in its early days, and for some reason it lost its way quite soon after that.
So you're speaking to somebody who's actually the son of political refugees in the United States from what was the former South Vietnam. So my parents lived through a communist revolution. My mother was sent to a labor camp with her. She was a teenager with all her siblings. They had the property confiscated. My father was sent to re-education camp for working in the police force, and that was seen as part of the former South Vietnamese government's regime. So it's interesting that with, I guess, our different ideological origins, I found myself still really admiring pretty much everything I've listened to you say. So I'm trying to reconcile, maybe it's out of perhaps my own ignorance of what Marxism is, because my interactions with Marxists are people who are in far less movements in Portland, like Antifa, who call themselves revolutionary and anti-capitalist, and really what I see are authoritarian militants.
Yeah, a lot of people today, Antifa is a good example. I think the Corbyn movement is another good example. I think the Squad in the US and the people who follow the Squad are another good example. A lot of people these days use the cover of Marxism to pursue what is in fact just authoritarian politics, quite bourgeois politics, quite an elitist form of politics, which is actually consumed by contempt for ordinary people and looks upon the masses with utter disdain. And you know, they use the cover of Marxism to make that politics look radical and revolutionary and historic when it's not. And it's worth bearing in mind that even in his own lifetime, Marx uttered the phrase, "If this is Marxism, all I know is that I am not a Marxist." I mean, Marx himself said that, and that was in response to some radical development in Europe. I can't remember what it was. So Marxism was going wrong even while Marx was around and writing. So, you know, I don't think, you know, I'm not going to defend any of the left-wing regimes of the 20th century. That would be completely bananas, because I believe in freedom and democracy, and they had neither of those attributes. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of what calls itself Marxism today is not Marxism in any meaningful sense of the word. Now, I know that you risk getting into the territory of saying, well, this is a real Marxist and that's a fake Marxist, and I'm not interested in that debate at all, at any level. But just the basic point is that Marxism was a universal political project. It was about bringing people together, the working classes, in order to fight against the powers that be, right? Today, left-wing contemporary politics, including a lot of what calls itself Marxism, is identitarian, it's separatist, it's divisive, it's very often anti-masses. It looks upon the masses as the problem because they're not sufficiently politically correct, they don't use the right language, they don't have the right attitudes. So that's just one example of how different it is. Another example is that Marxism in its early years was very anti-Malthusian, very anti the idea that there were natural limits to what humanity could achieve. And Marx's point, he described Malthus's writings, his kind of depressing writings about overpopulation. Marx called them a libel on the human race. And he said they naturalized poverty. And in fact, the real barrier to human advance is social, not natural. So Marxism was very skeptical of natural explanations for shortages. Now you fast forward 150 years and the left is completely consumed by a naturalistic view of the world through its embrace of the miserablest apocalyptic politics of environmentalism. And one other example is freedom. Early Marx in the 1840s and 50s, when he was very young, he wrote some of the best defenses of press freedom you will ever read. It just articulates perfectly why freedom of speech and press freedom are so essential to a civilized society. So did other early Marxist writers, often wrote about the question of freedom. And so did Trotsky. Trotsky wrote a fantastic defense of press freedom when he was in Mexico. And all these radical left-wing groups were calling on the state to ban far-right newspapers. That sounds familiar to us today. And Trotsky wrote a piece saying, if you believe the state should censor the far-right, then get the hell out of the working class movement. We don't want you here. So I'm not saying all this to be nostalgic. I just think on three fundamental issues, in fact, the three fundamental issues, which is the question of freedom, the question of economic growth, and the question of universalism. I mean, those were core components of the early radical left-wing project. The left today has abandoned all of those. It's now particularist rather than universalist. It's now illiberal rather than pro-freedom. And it now obsesses over saving the planet rather than growing the economy to provide enough stuff for all human beings. So I often make the argument, I haven't changed. I still believe in all that stuff. I still believe we need a huge economy. We need no more poverty. We need as much freedom and choice as is humanly possible. It's not me that's changed, it's the left. And, it's that old cliche, I didn't leave the left left me. And I do feel that very strongly about the contemporary left.
Don't you find like your positions now seem to be more of a libertarian position?
Well, in some instances, yeah, particularly in relation to freedom of speech, I guess, where I am a free speech absolutist. I don't think there should be censorship of anything at all. And I have used the word libertarian to describe myself in recent years. I've sometimes called myself a left libertarian, which makes more sense to American listeners than it would to British listeners, because we don't have many of them at all. I've even called myself a Marxist libertarian. But I'm losing faith in libertarianism very, very fast. I think I've made this point a couple of times at talks in the US over the past couple of years. I think libertarianism is not cut out for the contemporary political climate, and I think it's making so many mistakes. Two instances in particular. I think libertarianism is overly suspicious of democracy. I mean, there's always been a strain in libertarianism which has seen democracy as potentially problematic, as the masses potentially clamping down on individual rights. They've always seen freedom as something that needs to be codified in constitutions precisely in order to protect it from the rabble who they presume to be instinctively illiberal. So there's always been an anti-democratic component. So I think they're utterly missing out on the radical, brilliant nature of things like Brexit or the Gilets Jaunes uprising or various populist revolts in Europe. They don't have the historical or moral resources to praise that stuff because they are instinctively suspicious of collective things and collective movements and collective votes. So they're missing a trick on democracy. And I also think their obsession with the state, and I say this as someone who is incredibly skeptical of the state and of state intervention into people's lives, but their obsession with the state as the cause of every ill in the world means that they are not capable of understanding the threat posed to freedom today by private companies and the Silicon Valley thing is such a good example of this. Libertarians are not equipped to criticize what I would consider to be one of the most problematic forms of censorship now, which is private censorship that doesn't come from the state. It isn't the jackboot on your neck. It is private companies who are, in the view of libertarians, simply exercising their property rights by expelling people from their social platforms who they don't want to have on those social platforms. And I've met libertarians who say that's fine. Property rights are the most important rights in the whole world, and therefore that's fine. And I just want to throttle them, because this is, in my view, one of the most menacing attacks on freedom of speech in the Western world right now. And we need to develop a broader pro-freedom attitude which criticizes both state censorship and legal censorship, of course, and private censorship, which I think is increasingly powerful and increasingly global.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on Antifa in Portland and various other things that keep happening there. For example, 2 white women who own a burrito food cart getting chased out of town, almost literally. Bakery firing all its workers because they didn't serve a black woman who came in after it closed. And then, of course, the videos that show almost the banality of political violence in Portland, where I live, of Antifa coming out to fight with right-wingers. And it may be amusing to see, but living there and being there, covering it, like, you see how innocent people get caught up in it. You know, whether if they're just trying to drive down the street, they get attacked, or somebody like me over 2 months ago covering it, recording a demonstration and then getting mob beaten and robbed. So I'm just wondering what your views are as somebody observing from afar.
I think it's dreadful. I think it's awful. I see Antifa in Portland and elsewhere too as the armed wing of political correctness and the armed wing of identity politics. And it really infuriates them when you say this to them, because they think they're radical and revolutionary and against the mainstream. They are the militant wing of mainstream politics. I think it's so important to get that across, because I have a problem with the idea that they should be designated as a terrorist group. So I'm instinctively wary when the state says, I can tell by the look on your face you probably disagree with me. I'm instinctively wary when the state says we're going to step in and decide that this group is terroristic and therefore should be subject to certain restrictions and rules. Because I think that's very often driven by an authoritarian instinct to control the speech and activities and freedom of association of groups who may well be deeply unpleasant, as Antifa are. But I'm also worried about it because I think it gives them the glamour that they long for, and this idea that they are outside of society, and this idea that they are above mainstream politics and the idiotic masses who they consider to have been brainwashed by newspapers and brainwashed by Fox News, and they're so dumb that they voted for Donald Trump. You know, they have this seething elitist, very upper middle class contempt for ordinary people, which is why they go around punching them in the head if they suspect that person voted for Donald Trump or whatever else they might have done. So they have this glamorous view of themselves as being edgy, radical, revolutionary forces, whereas I think they are incredibly status quo forces. They are maintaining what is the contemporary ideology of the ruling class, to use old Marxist language, which is the divisive politics of identity, the extreme politics of political correctness, which is a myopic obsession with policing all forms of speech and fundamentally thought. So you give the examples of them hounding white women who sell burritos, or closing down a baker's who refused to serve a black person at a particular time of day. This all suggests to me that they are policing the parameters of racial politics and identity politics. And I thought when you got milkshaked, for example, I know it was far more violent than a milkshaking, but I thought even that was revealing, because milkshaking in its current form took off here in the UK. Nigel Farage was milkshaked, Tommy Robinson, Carl Benjamin, various people were milkshaked, and it was completely and utterly celebrated by the liberal establishment here. including The Guardian, which is the voice of the liberal establishment. I mean, The Guardian thinks it's a radical newspaper, which is absolutely hilarious. It is the voice of the public sector. It's the voice of the intellectual establishment. It's the voice of the BBC, fundamentally. It's the voice of the contemporary establishment, the new establishment. They were celebrating, the newspaper celebrated milkshaking. They said it's not violence at all. It's simply a way of bringing down pompous figures and making them realise that they're not as good as they think they are. So they effectively incited that form of violence. The fact that then a couple of weeks after that, you had people, Antifa in Portland, embracing the milkshaking phenomenon in a very self-conscious way. So they had the van handing out milkshakes. So they embraced this liberal elite endeavour from the United Kingdom and took it on as one of their own activities. And I thought, well, there you go. That it tells you exactly who is influencing these people and where they're getting their ideas from. They're not getting their ideas from Das Kapital. They're not getting their ideas from some revolutionary cell in some hidden basement in Portland in which they discuss how to overthrow capitalism. They're getting their ideas from the bloody Guardian. The squarest, most pathetic, wettest liberal newspaper in the Western world. This is their political Bible. So I think it is worth making the point that I know there's a temptation to call them extremists and crazy and terrorists even. I do think it's worth resisting that. Firstly, because of the potential authoritarian consequences. And secondly, because I think the thing that damages them most is drawing out the logical conclusion of how mainstream they are and the fact that they are effectively the policemen of identity politics. They are enforcing status quo ideology. They are not challenging anything whatsoever apart from people's freedom to gather in public.
You're known as a crusader for Brexit. And can you help explain to an American audience why Brexit and, in your view, British sovereignty is so important?
See, now Brexit is radical. This is the way I would put it. I think Brexit is incredibly radical. I think it was an extreme act of defiance. I mean, it's hard to explain to non-British listeners what it was like in the UK in 2016, in the run-up to June 2016 when we had the vote. But in essence, every single wing of the establishment was pleading with us to vote Remain. The whole business establishment, the whole political establishment, of course, every international organisation. Barack Obama came here and said, vote Remain or else you're screwed. The IMF, of course, the EU, the UN. I mean, every powerful establishment institution on earth said, vote Remain, otherwise your lives are screwed. And what did we do? We went and voted Leave. It was the most rebellious act that British voters have carried out in the 100 years since we got the vote. Last year, in 2018, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of working class men and some women getting the vote in this country, which happened with the Representation of the People Act in 1918. Every year, every election we've had from 1918 to 2016 was simply choosing a political party to run the country. So it wasn't a particularly inspiring choice. The parties became increasingly similar over time. No one was particularly moved by these elections. But suddenly in 2016, we had a vote where we were being asked to rethink the entire constitutional makeup of the country. And we were given on a silver platter an opportunity to say fuck you to the establishment. And people grabbed that vigorously. And they thought to themselves, we're not wasting this opportunity. And that's why voter turnout went up from its average of about 60% to 72%. The kind of parts of England, particularly very poor parts of England where people never vote, got out and voted. And so people seized this opportunity to revolt. And so I think that's an incredibly valuable thing in and of itself. I think the meltdown that we've seen since the vote for Brexit, where the entire British establishment has gone nuts, have exposed their underlying authoritarianism, their underlying anti-democracy, their underlying illiberalism, all these things that they kept pretty well hidden for the decades preceding the vote on the EU membership. They kept that. I knew it was there. Lots of people knew it was there, and you'd see flashes of it with legislation or the launching of wars or whatever else it might be. But they kept it well hidden beneath a veneer that was quite liberal and pro-democracy and pro-people and so on. All of that disappeared, and the viciousness of the political elite became very clear, so that now they are engaged in an explicit attempt to overthrow the vote for Brexit. So that's a valuable thing to know. And it's just, and the other great thing about Brexit is that I think it ignited so much of the populist revolt that we are witnessing around the world. Lots of gilets jaunes wave placards saying Frexit. They want to leave France to leave the European Union. When I go to Europe, people talk to me about Brexit all the time. When's this happening? How isn't it exciting? In the US, of course, Trump referred to certain states that he was keen to win or is keen to win next time too as Brexit states. States that could potentially revolt, could potentially do the thing that they're not meant to do. So it's become this byword for pissed offness with the contemporary establishment. And the fact that England, the UK fundamentally, but really England and Wales, which are the two countries in the UK which voted in majorities for Brexit, whereas Scotland and Northern Ireland voted in majorities for Remain, the fact that England and Wales are the kind of cauldron of this energetic, democratic populist revolt, I find just really thrilling.
A lot of Americans are quite ignorant about international politics, and they don't really understand the relationship between the UK and the EU. They kind of just think of like the EU as this great institution that makes all these smaller countries get along better and have better economic relationships with one another. So help explain to American listeners why you see EU as a threat to British sovereignty.
Yeah. Americans aren't alone if they think that. I mean, lots of Remainers in the UK, and these are often very well-educated people who should know better, they will say the same thing. They'll say, look, the European Union is this great institution. It's brought the countries of Europe together. We don't have world wars anymore, blah, blah, blah. It's completely untrue. The European Union is an illiberal, undemocratic, divisive, racist institution. And just to give you a couple of examples on how it throttles national democracy. So the European Union can write laws that I have to live by, but I have no capacity whatsoever to vote for the people who write those laws. That runs counter to every single leap forward in the battle for democracy over the past 300 or 400 years, whether it was in England or America or France or wherever else there may have been democratic revolutions, where the rallying cry was always that human beings, individuals, adults, must have the capacity to consent to and dissent from the people who make the laws that they are expected to live by.
But you can vote for MEPs.
But this is what people often say. The European Parliament does not initiate European legislation. Legislation in Europe, and by legislation in Europe I mean EU legislation that more than 500 million Europeans must abide by, is proposed by the European Council, which is unelected. It's appointed. You have as much capacity as an American citizen as I do to influence who is on the European Council. I couldn't name any of them to you, and the vast majority of people in this country couldn't name them. They propose legislation. The role of the European Parliament is effectively to copper fasten that legislation, to nod it through. Every now and then they'll bat it back, but they do not initiate the legislation. So the European Parliament is widely recognised by everyone who knows the basics about democracy as the gloss, the democratic gloss on what is fundamentally an undemocratic project. And that's how it works. So it works in a very undemocratic way, but it behaves in a very undemocratic way. So, for example, when the Irish people voted against the Nice Treaty in 2001 and the Lisbon Treaty in 2008, these were treaties that would have expanded the authority of the European Union. The Irish people voted against them. On both occasions, they were forced to vote again under threat of economic hardship, and second time round they voted in favour of these treaties. The French voted against the European Constitution in a referendum. The Dutch voted against the European Constitution in a referendum. Both votes were completely ignored. The Greeks voted quite recently against the imposition of European Union sanctions, economic sanctions. They were ignored, and those measures were imposed anyway. The European Union has imposed an unelected technocratic government on Italy I mean, in 2011, this is in living memory, that an unelected government was running Italy on behalf of the European Union. Also in 2010, the European Union sent the Troika, which was a bunch of organisations. It sent them to Ireland to run the Irish economy in defiance of the wishes of Ireland's elected officials. This is an explicitly dreadfully anti-democratic organisation. It explicitly limits national democracy, and it explicitly weakens the ordinary people's right to determine the future of the nation that they live in. And so I think the vote for Brexit and against the European Union was a brilliant blow for democracy, which was entirely in keeping with some of England's finest radical traditions.
Brendan, what I really appreciate about you is your bravery in going after sacred cows. You seem to not hold back. One person that's become kind of a untouchable because of her age is Greta Thunberg, but you've come out against her quite a bit. Tell me, why do you see her as problematic?
Problematic. Well, I think she's been messed up. I mean, I think the problem is adults rather than Greta herself. I mean, Greta actually has some admirable qualities. I mean, she's really driven. She's incredibly focused. I mean, she's sailing across the Atlantic, for heaven's sake, in a yacht, which is quite a risky thing to do. So she's brave and or reckless, I guess. So she's got some good qualities, but I think, to be perfectly honest, she scares me. She scares me because, and I don't mean in the way that environmentalists want me to be scared by her, which is to, panic about the environment and suddenly start recycling all my rubbish and that stuff. She scares me because I think she is symptomatic of the adult world's installation of fear and panic into the next generation. And I think one of the worst things that adult society, liberal elite society really, is doing right now is instilling absolute dread into the next generation about the future of the planet, about the environment, about the climate. And so you hear Greta say things like, I want you to panic, the house is on fire, my generation will all be dead. I mean, this is real politics, a psychotic politics of fear. It's like in the 80s, when we were very young kids in the 80s, we were constantly told to be scared of nuclear war and the potential destruction of the earth by Russia and America and their nuclear weapons. And it worked to a certain extent. You would find yourself feeling scared on a kind of daily basis. And we watched films at school about what to do in a kind of nuclear holocaust. Hide under your desk and don't look at the bright explosion, all this kind of nonsense. But what we have now is worse, because there's no pushback against it at all. There are no reasoned, rational voices, as far as I can tell, in the establishment saying, look, let's calm down, let's relax, the future's not that bad. So the reason I've criticised the cult of Greta Thunberg is because I think it shows how destructive the politics of environmentalism can be in terms of whipping up a politics of fear, which I think is unjustified and incredibly destructive of the quality of human life. And so my great concern is that Greta has a sad life. She's scared and worried, and she's not going to school, and adults have lost the plot and are now, instead of comforting children, are giving them rounds of applause as those children effectively stand on stage and cry and say, I think I'm going to die soon. That's not something that adults should give a round of applause to.
My concern with many powerful people making Greta the face of climate change activism is that this is a very vulnerable young girl. She has struggled for a long time with serious anxieties to the point where she stopped eating and her life basically stopped functioning. She wasn't able to go to school. Her parents had to stop working to be able to provide support for her. And one of the things that she picked up after this episode was her concern with the environment, her extreme concern. And to see her taken all around the world and pushed in front of televisions when this is somebody who's is open about her difficulties in being in social environments as she is on the spectrum. I just wonder if if she has enough adults in her life really looking out for her. So with that sacred cow out, the next one I wanted to ask you about is multiculturalism. I mean, we're not that far from Whitechapel, which is part of the borough Tower Hamlets. Tower Hamlets is a very heavily Muslim area that's seen quite a drastic demographic change in a relatively short period of time. But this is just one anecdote across many anecdotes of Britain of a larger trend of multiculturalism policies and encouraging basically some communities to stay separate.
Yeah. I have a real problem with the ideology of multiculturalism, and it's why whenever you say that, people think you want Britain to be white.
Yep.
And I have no interest in Britain being white. I mean, it's not possible anymore because there are lots and lots of non-white people here, and that's perfectly okay. So I don't have a problem with multi-ethnicity. And some of the finest countries on earth are multi-ethnic countries. America is a very good example. One of my favorite places in the world is New York City, which works pretty well. And it's a real patchwork of ethnic groups and national groups and so on. So I don't have a problem with multi-ethnicity. I have a problem with the ideology of multiculturalism, which, as its name suggests, is entirely about saying that a nation should value more than one culture and should not have its own overarching aspirational culture. So multiculturalism is in fact the ideology that fills the gap where British cultural values used to be. So where we used to say, this is Britain, this is what we believe, these are our values, this is how democracy works, this is how our institutions work. Come here, please, we need you to work for the NHS or to work on building sites, as my father came here to do from Ireland. We need you, come here. But this is how it works, so please integrate into our society. We don't say that anymore. Instead we say, come here and do whatever the hell you like. And in fact, if you do what you like, it won't only be okay, it will be good, because it will prove how multicultural we are. So we have these ethnic cultural bubbles where people have values that run entirely counter to what ought to be celebrated as core British values. So it's a recipe for division, it's a recipe for tension, and it's a recipe for violence. I've made the argument many times, and made myself very unpopular in the process, that Islamist terrorism in the UK, and we've had a pretty huge amount of it, not quite as much as France, but not far behind, is a product of decades of encouraging Muslim communities not only to live separately to the rest of us, but to be actively hostile to mainstream society. Because if you constantly tell young Muslims in particular that Britain is a really horrible Islamophobic society, it's really racist, and there's a epidemic of Islamophobia, and everyone hates Muslims and everyone hates Islam because they're all so pig ignorant, they don't understand your culture. Of course they're going to grow up hating mainstream society. Of course they're going to grow up thinking that ordinary British people are scum. And, you know, I was fascinated to read that the young man who blew up Manchester Arena in 2017 and killed 21 people, including very young girls, he, according to his friends, was convinced that Britain is an Islamophobic society. Now, where could he have got an idea from that? He got it from the mainstream multicultural thesis, which is that Britain is this horrible post-imperial, post-colonial, white, racist nation. So it doesn't only encourage separatism. I think that's really important, because when my parents came here, we lived in a separatist way too, in fact. You know, they came here in 1970 from Ireland. We lived in an Irish community in London. I never met any English people. I had an Irish accent until I was 8 or 9 years old, and this is in London. Then eventually I lost it. We didn't meet English people, we didn't meet Protestant people. Everything was quite contained. Everyone we spoke to was Irish. Our school was like 90% Irish, and then there was a few Italians and maybe a couple of Sri Lankans. Our church was Irish. Everything was Irish. So we lived in a bit of a cultural bubble, and it had its plus sides because it meant you could get work. You had close connections. My mother could speak to people and talk about the homeland. So there were plus sides. And of course, there were downsides because we were very bubbled from mainstream society. So that has always existed. And it's not always immigrants' fault because British society can be difficult to integrate into. It's not as if it's a walk in the park. It can be difficult. So that's always happened. What's different now is not only do we say, live in your own bubble, it's fine, it's great, we'll celebrate it. We also say, and you should be suspicious of the rest of us. You should be hostile to the rest of us because we're really unpleasant people. We're racist and stupid and Islamophobic and we all voted for Brexit and we're a danger to you. We're a threat to you. And that's why I think something like the Muslim grooming gangs is actually very important. I think it's a very important cultural moment because what you have there is not simply opportunistic sexual abuse. I'm sure some of it was opportunistic. You know, these men found themselves in positions where vulnerable girls were in their path and they opportunistically abused them. But I think it also speaks to a cultural dynamic where you have these men who grew up in Muslim communities which came over time to view the white people of the United Kingdom in a hostile way. Lazy, stupid, racist. And so if they then came to view those people in a dehumanized way, particularly white working class women as slags, and you know they're much lower form of life than Muslim women. You know, they're all slags and they have bad upbringing and they're not very well educated. All these prejudices which actually are expressed in mainstream society as well as in certain Muslim communities. I think what that speaks to is a cultural dynamic where the more that you encourage certain communities to feel a hostility towards the mainstream culture, the more you store up these divisions, these tensions, and even forms of abuse and forms of violence. So I think the distinctive difference now is not simply the fact that immigrants cling together, because that's always happened at some level, but society encourages that and society intensifies it by also saying to immigrant communities, the mainstream of society is out to get you, so you should ignore us or even potentially harm us.
And what should be done?
What should be done is I think we need to recover a sense of what Britain is about and not be afraid to insist that people integrate into it. Integration is now, assimilation is now basically a dirty word. You're not even allowed to say it. It's like a form of fascism. If you say, I think immigrants should assimilate, people think you're Adolf Hitler. It's bizarre. I think assimilation should be encouraged. I think it's good for society and I think it's good for immigrants. You know, there are a number of immigrants in London, a significant number, including in Tower Hamlets, which you mentioned, who can't speak English. And the liberal elite, the kind of relativist sections of the establishment will say that's fine. In fact, that's good. You know, what a wonderfully diverse country we live in. But it's not good. It's not good for anyone. It's not good for those immigrants whose ability to engage in everyday life is limited, or whose ability to break out of their community and go somewhere else is very limited, or whose ability to leave the family home and engage in a conversation over the garden fence with the woman who's from Essex or something is very limited. So it's limiting on those individuals, and it's bad for society too, because there are some core elements of a society that immigrants should aspire to integrate into. One is language, one is values, one is a sense of belonging to this nation that you've just joined. So I think this is where I have some disagreements with some people on the right, whose solution to this problem, and it is a problem, their solution is, well, let's stop immigration. Let's particularly stop Muslim immigration. And I think targeting any form of immigration and saying we can't have that form is a bad idea, and that sets a dangerous precedent. I'm generally a pretty pro-immigration kind of guy. If it wasn't for immigration, I wouldn't be in this country, and I quite like being in this country. I think immigration is a good thing, but there are 2 points. Firstly, it needs to be a product of democratic discussion. We need to convince people that immigration is a good idea. We can't do it over their heads, which is the preferred route of the European Union and its liberal cheerleaders, simply to enforce immigration regardless of what people think about it. So it has to be a democratic option. And secondly, it has to come with a genuine, all-out, profound commitment to encouraging migrants to embrace this society that they're moving into and to become part of it in a real way in order to get rid of the divisions and tensions that we currently have.
But how do you reconcile that with your strong belief that the state should be small and not intervene in people's lives? Seems like you would support separatism in some ways, would you not?
I think there's a difference between not wanting the state to curb individual freedom and allowing a cultural free-for-all. So, for example, I am completely against the idea, which I know has been made by right-wing populists, some right-wing populists in Europe. I'm completely against the idea of banning the Quran. I'm even against the idea of banning the niqab, and I really dislike the niqab. When I see it makes me quite angry because I think it's such an antisocial, archaic, medieval garment. But I'm against a state ban on it because, well, for various reasons. Firstly, I think it will make those individual women's lives even harder because they won't go out. And secondly, because it represents, in my view, an intolerable intervention of the state into freedom of religion and freedom of expression. So there's that. On the one side, I don't think the solution to these problems is state intervention or state control. But I do think the state, that's a nasty word, but what I mean is I do think civil society has a role to play in creating a culture that invites people to integrate, which sends out the message that Britain is a bloody good country. It's pretty free, it's pretty liberal, it's pretty democratic, it's got a really interesting history. This is a good country to live in. Civil society has a role to play in sending that message and encouraging newcomers and helping newcomers to integrate. But that doesn't mean I think the state should have the right to stop people from doing certain things. So it's about getting the balance right between feeling pretty put out by the fact that there are loads of people walking around with niqabs or speaking foreign languages, exclusively foreign languages. I don't mind people speaking, they can speak whatever language they want. So you can feel put out by that stuff without saying the state needs to step in and stop it. I think there's a more liberal, open-minded approach which can encourage people to integrate into the UK.
Do you think the contradictions of multiculturalism will cause it to collapse? I'm just thinking how in the UK, up north, you're having all these Muslim communities protest months on end outside of primary schools because they object to some of the LGBT curriculum. I
support those parents. I know, I've lost so many readers over this question. But your question is absolutely right. I mean, that's such a good example of the tensions that are developed under multiculturalism. So this is the case of the Birmingham primary schools. So the attendees at the schools are very young, 6, 7, 8 years old. And these schools, like schools across the country, have brought in this education system called No Outsiders, and it's about encouraging kids to learn about trans relationships and two gay parents and all this kind of stuff. And lots of Muslim parents are saying, no, we don't want little Muhammad to learn about transgenderism. We don't want Fatima learning about gay relationships. So stop it. And so they've had these protests. And I think they are right. I think they are right when they say that the moral guidance of children should fall under the sovereignty of the family and the rights of parents. And I think schools overstep the mark when they move away from educating children or teaching children to be well behaved, which I think is definitely part of a school's remit, into giving them dogmatic moral guidance and saying and inculcating them in the ideology of political correctness, which is essentially what's happening here. And political correctness is in many ways the state religion. And I don't want schools to force this religion down children's throats if their parents don't want the children to have it. So I think those parents have a good point. However, the broader issue that you raise is really important because the other side of this discussion is the question of why these parents are so antagonistic towards gay rights. And the reason they're so antagonistic to gay rights is because lots of the liberals and lefties who are currently quite horrified by these parents have been complicit in an ideological multicultural system which has precisely said to communities like this, you can believe what you want, you can follow your own values, you don't have to adhere to mainstream values. And of course, one of the mainstream values in the UK in 2019 is gay equality, female equality, and so on. And I agree, those are very good values. So this is the great irony of this moment, of this clash in Birmingham, where you have, for the first time in my memory, lefties and liberals, including Guardianistas, are criticising Muslims. And they're saying to them, oh, what are you doing? These protests are really out of order. Stop it. Without realising that they bear a lot of responsibility for the fact that there are significant sections of this society who don't buy into what the rest of us consider to be pretty mainstream principles. And the reason they don't buy into it is because we've told them for 40 or 50 years that they don't have to. So it absolutely speaks to the unbearable tensions, I would say, of multiculturalism. But it's also really complicated because going back to the question of freedom, I think parents ought to have the freedom to bring up their children as they see fit. And I think the state oversteps the mark when it is encouraging 6-year-old children to make rainbow pride posters and to put them on the school gates as a provocation against the protesting parents, which is what's happened in Birmingham. So I look at that clash and I think this tells us that multiculturalism is a real screw-up, that the state is overstepping the mark in the inculcation of children in political correctness, and that Muslims really are outside of mainstream values. So much that's wrong in contemporary Britain is exposed by that clash in Birmingham.
So your country voted to leave the EU in 2016. Well, we're now in the second half of 2019. You're still in the EU. So what's going to happen?
Good question. It's unpredictable. It's also very exciting, I think. British politics hasn't been this exciting in my lifetime. It's been really dull, in fact, as politics has been across the Western world. In the kind of, the third way era, the post left-right era, when politics became very technocratic, very managerial, very business-like. Clinton was one of the leaders of that in the US. Blair was the leader in the UK, and there was various forces in Europe doing the same thing. What Brexit has done is said, no, sod that. We want politics to go back to being full of competing questions and issues and with the pesky voice of ordinary people right in the centre of it. So it's intolerable to the establishment, and they will not let it happen. So you are currently in a country in which the people want one thing and the political establishment wants another. The people want to leave the European Union. The political establishment, more than 70% of MPs, more than 75% of business leaders, want to stay in the European Union. So it's one of the great, fascinating, conflictual tensions of modern Western politics. At the moment, the establishment is winning. And as you say, it's more than 3 years since we voted to leave and we're still in. So they are getting their way. But things could break very soon. And there is the lesson of English history in particular, but also British history more broadly, is that there's only so much crap people are willing to take before they take action. And I think that is the next arena we might be heading into.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you.
And that was Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked Online. If you enjoy my work, please consider becoming a supporter through Subscribestar, Patreon, or PayPal. As an independent journalist, this work is only possible through your support. Even a few dollars a month helps me a lot. You can find the links in the description.